India. Most expensive watch in India that you can buy is 8.4 crores. The most expensive school in India that pays about 20.5 lakhs per year. It's based in Uttarakhand. Would love to really see what they really have. The most expensive dinner, that's at Taj, Mumbai, is about 1.5 lakhs. The most expensive house, none other than, guess whose house this? Antilla, of course. Antilla, which is 15,000 crores. Most expensive t-shirt, which is built completely out of gold, is 1.3 crores. Anugrah, you want one? The most expensive tea in India is 1 lakh per kg. Would love to have that green tea with Anna on this. And the most expensive car in India, again, guess it's none other than Dhandapani, which is 13.14 crores. And the most expensive shoes in India is 15 lakhs, none other than Nike. And the list can go on. But where do we stop? What is one thing that is expensive that cannot be purchased? No matter what we have as materials throughout the day, no matter what we want to own throughout our life, one thing which is so expensive that cannot be purchased is definitely the death of Jesus Christ on the cross. Just to set the introduction, I've taken the passage from Luke 23:46 that I've casted this as Jesus' death on the cross, and the verse says, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, Father, into your hands I commend my spirit. And when he had said this, he breathed his last. So kind of underline that last, just to bring an introspective about, is death on the cross a new news to us? Apparently no. We've been hearing it for decades. And how Jesus won over the cross is something that we speak year on year at the time of Easter. What personally kind of created a contemplation within me is, at times I think we forget the pain what the man in the middle cross went through. And I think most of the time we take it for granted that what was the pain that he went through. So that's when I thought, okay, we all know Jesus shed his last blood on the cross, and then he was slain as a lamb, and then we are victorious, living out of sin. That is paid all. I wanted to highlight the word paid. What did it mean to pay? If I'm going to say that I'm going to pay my EMI today, which means I'll have to earn, I'll have to work, I'll have to earn, I'll have to get my check, the check has to get deposited in the bank, the money has to come through, then I make a transaction or there's an auto clearance to the EMI to be paid. The paid involves a lot of process. When Jesus is being told that he paid for our sins, what was the process that he went through, especially in the last moments on the cross? So that's exactly what I'm trying to bring in a perception. A bit of scientific data, bit of medical hypothesis as well, but I'm trying to justify that we'll have to remember when someone says that you are being blessed by the sins that has been taken away by Jesus, by what he made, what he did on the cross. Let me just set the table. We'll speak about what is the act of crucifixion historically. We'll also see what was the global perspective about crucifixion. Primarily, we always thought when Jesus was crucified there, what happened to the rest of the world? What were they doing? Today, it's not like Nityananda starts an ashramam there and then part of the UNO organization, and the very next second we are received in WhatsApp. Right? It's not that way. It's about decades back where there's absolutely no communication. But what did the world taken when crucifixion was going through? And why Jesus? Could be a very standard, common question, but would like to bring some perspective around that. And some medical hypothesis which I kind of researched around, very significantly close to what the truth could be, and I leave it to the Spirit to lead it in a right way. And last is, what did Jesus go through in his last few moments? And there are key takeaways. There are three key takeaways, 3 T's, that which we will kind of mull and meditate. And we'll conclude. The act of crucifixion. The act of crucifixion, as we all know, it's a capital punishment that is invented by Persians in 300 and 400 BC, but widely renowned and adopted by multiple other civilizations, but famously known for Roman Empire. Basically, they brought this for executioners to execute the one who were considered to be enemies of the state. And that's where the capital punishment was greatly followed by ancient Roman Empire. The person being crucified would slowly suffocate due to weight of their body pulling down on their arms and restricting their breathing. The execution itself is a process that can go for several hours. At times it's reported that it's gone for several days. The person being crucified would slowly suffocate due to the weight that kind of pulls down. We'll go a little more in detail. But this is just basic to set the context of what is the act of crucifixion. But crucifixion itself involves, there are 5 processes as staged. To begin with, it's scourging or flogging. Scourging or flogging is none other than the condemned person would be severely whipped or beaten, often with a flagrum. I've got some images to show, which had pieces of metal or even a sheep bone attached. That's called scourging or flogging. Second is carrying the cross. Carrying the cross is significantly, we have seen and we've heard about what Jesus went through, and we'll speak a little more in detail on that. Laning or binding, and there are 5 points where it was nailed. There's a merge of the alphabets. It's raising the cross, the 4th, and the 5th is penalizing death. These are 5 typical processes when one is going through a crucifixion process. But let's see, what was the global perspective about the act of crucifixion? When it occurred, and as a matter of fact, like I said, the crucifixion itself was invented by Persian civilization in 300 to 400 BC. And some of the civilization known to have practiced crucifixion, like Persians or Carthaginians, who were an ancient civilization in North Africa. Greek and of course famously known by Roman Empire. But today, crucifixion is no longer a capital punishment or a legal punishment. It's been treated or considered to be the most cruel and inhuman form of punishment. But still there are certain groups worldwide that they followed for a different purpose altogether. When Jesus was crucified, it was a time of observance of Passover. That was the time when Jesus was crucified, which is the famous Jewish festival. So which means there were travelers and tourists who were there in presence and witnessing the act of crucifixion, and probably they were the first point to come and spread it back to the world on how Jesus was nailed and what happened to Jesus' death as a penalty of what he didn't do, but rather what he was called. And at the time, Jerusalem was a major center of trade and commerce, and many people from different parts of the world would have been in the city. I'll just take a very real-time example. I mean, last month as a family, we traveled to Chikmagalur. Until then, I've never seen a coffee plantation or a coffee seed, but when we entered the small town and city, the entire town smelled a kind of very different fragrance or very different aura. And we're very, kind of like, never had that fragrance before. So when we reached the place where we stayed, we asked them the first thing, what is the smell that we are getting in here? And they said, it is the blossom of coffee flower, and this is the only season that happens, and you are fortunate too. Now when I come back, and when I drink a sip of coffee, I'm personally reminded of that flavor or the fragrance what I had. But nevertheless, I can't kind of recollect it all the more, but it stays in a memory. So I was just trying to relate if that could be the time where tourists and travelers were there. Definitely they were Gentiles, they were not Jews, who were not expected to believe Jesus to be the Savior or Messiah. But if they had seen what happened, probably they were traders or they were tourists, or for whatever reason they were, when they would come back, when they saw something related to death, they would have been definitely reminded of the flavor of what Jesus went through death. Until unless the Holy Spirit kind of personally convicted them. But that was the only way the perspective about how the word got spread through these. But after Jesus' death, then the disciples went out and the new empire and the kingdom was built. The designation, and again, why this BC and AD came through, again from a global perspective, is most of the time we confuse AD as after death, but apparently not. It is the meaning called Anno Domini, provided I've pronounced it right, which means in the year of the Lord. When Pope had called in the monk by name Dionysius in the 6th century, he was designated to identify the Jesus birth here. He took up the Jesus birth here as AD 1, and from then the kind of concluded AD and BC. So technically, Jesus was crucified in AD 33, 33 years from the time that he was born. So BC and AD. So from a view of the entire world, crucifixion is an act that was seen, that was heard at different parts. And of course, the history is divided now as before Christ was born and AD, which is after that he had come, from the year of the Lord. So there is definitely a lot of imprint about it. But always we think, why Jesus? Though we are Christians, we've heard so much about why Jesus had to go through, and today we enjoy the privilege of the victory of winning over the sin. The basics remain the same. The basics is he was accused by the Jewish leaders of blasphemy. He called himself as King of Jews. He made claims that he will be the Son of God. And he also made claims himself that were reserved just for God. And potentially he was a threat to the rulers of Jewish culture. So these were the claims that it was brought against Jesus. And that's why Jesus had to get into that state of death. I will personally take from understanding what the Roman empires were, and with Jewish, a set of people who do not believe Jesus are, I think the potential threat of Jesus may become the ruler was probably more than the rest of it. But I also want to kind of draw attention to what were the interlinked biblical prophecies of Jesus' death on the cross from Old Testament. Psalm 22, 16, 18 says, "Dogs surround me, a pack of villains encircle me. They pierce my hands and my feet. All my bones are on display. People stare and gloat over me. They divide my clothes among them and cast lots for my garment." Isaiah chapter 53, 5 says, "But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed." And again, Isaiah 53, 9 says, "He was assigned a grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death, though he had done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth." It clearly says that the man so-called Jesus had nothing to do, but he was supposed to go through. But along with Jesus, historically, two other men also kind of contributed to the image what we see as crucifixion. Why those two men? Those two men, again in Matthew 27, 38, calls them as robbers. But while Mark and Luke use the Greek word called lestai, which means they were either bandits or revolutionaries. But ultimately we know the truth of life, that the man in the middle cross said, "Come home and you will be with me in paradise," which is one of the 7 words that Jesus spoke from the cross. One of the check. One of the men is believed to have repented and acknowledged Jesus is the Lord before his death, while the other remained defiant. I always thought why the concentration went on only on the man in the middle of the cross who believed and then he had paradise. Why not the Roman soldier who was down, who also said that probably this man is innocent? We do not know if he was in paradise on the same day or when he was dead and gone. But the concentration was always on that one man who repented and who would have been with Jesus in the paradise. But regardless of what their identities, as a powerful symbol of the universal nature of sin and the redemptive power of Jesus' sacrifice, they too have contributed to the image. So the minute we talk about crucifixion, apparently both those two men also are part of the image. But let's see some medical hypotheses about Jesus' death. There could be some disturbing images. I've taken Jenny's permission that kids are okay to be in there, so I've kind of restricted a little, but if I do speak about it, it is the truth that we would like to kind of evolve. Medical hypotheses about Jesus I have divided into 3 categories. First, from the time that he prayed in Mount Olives until the time he reaches to the place of crucifixion, which is Golgotha. And then what Jesus called out in the Last Supper, that this is my body, which is broken. So I've categorized as break the bread. Literally, what symbolic representation that Jesus broke the bread is something that what happened to his body himself. And thirdly, how excruciating was the cross. These are some medical hypotheses that I have researched on, I would want to present here. Okay, so what was the Mount Olive story on Golgotha? Jesus wasn't definitely extremely fit as a carpenter, no doubt about it. He spent much of his ministry traveling on foot across the countryside. And definitely he would have had his best of stamina, best of his ability. But what happened in the contrary in Mount Olives? Mount Olives, when he gave himself into spirit, he went in, as Luke 22:44 says, and being in anguish, he prayed more earnestly. And his sweat was like drops of blood falling to the ground. Let me ask a question. How many of us will believe that he really sweat blood, or is there a different symbolic representation? Do we believe that Jesus really sweat blood? Yes? So what does the science says? There's a very rare medical condition called hematodrosis, which Jesus must have experienced. So what is hematodrosis? Like I said, it might sound like a scientific class, but with little understanding that I picked up. This is the sweat gland onto your right. And whatever stress that you got to go through, I don't know why this document starts talking about all possible stress, but physiological stress, physical stress, and it gives a signal to the brain. Brain is calling out a distress response, and it moves to the hormones. And from the hormones, it comes to your capillary, which is the bloodstream which gets created. From the bloodstream, there's a rupture, and the rupture gets impaired into your sweat gland, and your red blood cells the red blood cells seep into the sweat gland, and the blood sweat comes out. And that's what the science, with very little of my understanding, basically is a rupture in the capillary which oozes out into the sweat gland, and from the sweat gland there's a blood sweat. Does it happen today? It happens, but what is the reason that medical scientists and thesis comes out as it's related to extreme stress and anxiety, allowing the blood, the content to seep into the sweet ducts. Under tremendous stress, the vessels contract. Once the anxiety passes, the blood vessels dilate to the point of rupture. The blood at this point goes into the sweat glands, which push to the blood to the face and manifests as droplets of blood mixed with sweat. And of course, as Matthew 26:38 says, what Jesus was going through as far as the anxiety is concerned, then he said to them, "My soul is sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and keep watch with me." That was his ask to the disciples. So that anxiety is what it caused. In reality, this does happen. People do sweat blood because of the very reason of anxiety or stress or extreme biological changes that happens that they're not able to handle. It does happen, and these are some true images. So what Jesus went through in the Mount Olives when he prayed, his anxiety levels were so high that he went through the medical condition that he had to sweat blood. And I would call it as this was the first blood, the drop of blood that has saved us today. In fact, there was the last blood of drop that comes out on the cross, but this very blood, very first blood drop, that saved us, that decided that he will save the rest of the mankind. It began here in the time of prayer at Mount Olives. And it continues to say in the Last Supper, and he took bread, gave thanks, and broke it, and gave it to them, saying, "This is my body given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." Luke 22:19. I've always thought that why was it bread? Why wasn't a meat? Or why wasn't something which was more harder? The bread was more of a metaphor to say how tender is the love of God for us, but how the tenderness itself was broken to save us. When he said that he took the bread and broke it, from the time that he was captivated at the garden and he was taken to Pilate and he was asked to be flogged before a crucifixion. Flogging or scourging is a prerequisite of Roman revelation that has to go through for every petitioned executioner who will have to go through crucifixion. The flogging means a whip that consisted of several strips of leather They call it as multiple thongs. In middle of the strips were metal balls that hit the skin, causing deep bruising. In addition, a sheep bone was attached to each of the strip. We read that there were about 7 strips that it had, and 7 strips was called as a flagrum or a flagellum that was most likely used to flog Jesus. When the bone makes contact, the sheep bone or the metal balls, whichever was right or truth, contacts with Jesus' skin, it digs it into his muscles, tearing out chunks of flesh and exposing the bone beneath. The flogging leaves the skin on Jesus' back like long ribbons. And again, there's always been a debate about how many lashes that he had to go through. From the Mosaic law in Deuteronomy 25:3, it says 40 stripes he may give him and not exceed. But again, Paul also calls it out in Corinthians that 5 times he received from the Jews the 40 lashes minus 1. He went through 39. But unfortunately, it was not the Jews who were executing Jesus. It was the Roman Empire. And they were not obliged to follow the Mosaic law. So it could have been just 39 or 40 or 60 or 70. Historically, there's no record of how many lashes that he went through. But God did went through this scourging or flogging. By this point, at the end of flogging, Jesus has already lost a great volume of blood, which causes his blood pressure to fall and puts him into a state of shock. A human body goes through a shock when there's a loss of blood. And of course, Jesus was not given a Bisleri bottle to drink and then the blood get refueled. He was not given water. Medical history says that just in case if he had been given water, the blood would have replenished back into the body, but which is not the case. They stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him and then twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on his head. Matthew 27:28. Why robe and why thorn? Robe was primarily intended to put across Jesus' body to clot his blood, just like how we put the cotton on our bleeding spot. It was made deliberately to put, of course, to cover his half-naked body while he had to carry the patibulum across the way of Golgotha, to Golgotha. The robe was put in to clot the blood. Thorn, this was the most devastating, what I read, the intention. From the biblical perspective, he was called as the King of Jews, so they put him a crown of thorn. But medically, what the thorn on his head could have done is the thorns can also damage the nerve that supplies the face, causing intense pain down his face and neck. There's a nerve which is called as trigeminal nerve, which essentially supplies all the blood that is required on the front of the head and across the neck. The trigeminal nerve runs through face, eyes, nose, mouth, jaws, and the nerve of the neck. When this crown was held on his forehead, Jesus must have gone into a condition called trigeminal neuralgia. Hope I'm pronouncing it right. This condition causes severe facial pain that may be triggered by a light touch or a swallowing or eating or talking or temperature changes. Forget, Jesus did not eat or talk or he did not drink water. But what worse could have happened is even a temperature change when the wind hit his body while he was walking towards Golgotha, he must have experienced a pain as good as stabbing his eyes. That is the cause, that is the kind of cost what that crown that has done to his head. Also, the soldiers struck Jesus on his head with reeds. He would have felt excruciating pain across his face and deep into his ears, much like a sensation of an electric shock. These pains would have been felt all the way to Calvary, till Golgotha, and while on the cross. As he walked and fell, he pushed and shoved. He moved any part of his face, and even a lightest breeze touched his face, new waves of intense pains would have triggered. This is the pain that intensified his state of traumatic shock. So the body continues to lose its blood. The body, and of course, as it says in the past record of while he is going through, his tenderness of the skin is starting to lose because of his flogging, and then now the nerves that is running through his face, through his nose and mouth and cheek and jaw and neck are starting to impact. That was the excruciating pain that Jesus went through. But speaking about the word excruciating, excruciating is derived from the word excrucier, which is a Greek word which means torment. Excrucier is derived from the word crucier, again, which is a Greek word which means crucify. So the word excruciating itself is derived from the word crucifixion. And no man has been recorded of what Jesus went through, the kind of pain, the kind of excruciating pain that he went through. Let's see how excruciating was the cross. Crucifixion, again, like I said, it was invented by the Persians in 300 to 400 BC. There were multiple types of crosses after being read. I understand the Greek cross, a Latin cross, and a Tor cross, and few more. It is believed that probably Jesus was nailed on the Tor cross. Tor is a Greek word. The Greek alphabet T is called Tor. So which means there is a vertical strip and a horizontal strip. And the cross is named as stipes, patibulum, and tetlus. Stipes is the vertical strip, and patibulum is the horizontal beam, and the tetlus is where the header which says King of Jews. So Jesus was expected, Jesus was believed that he carried only the patibulum, whereas the stipes was vertically positioned at Golgotha, which is a permanent fixture. He has carried just, I'm believing the theory that says that he carried only the horizontal beam, which means Jesus was nailed only on the horizontal beam, and the horizontal beam had to go and fit into the Titus, which is a permanent fixture on the place of Golgotha. Psalm 22:14, it reminds me to take this verse. I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. Out of joint, when Jesus was nailed with 6 to 9 inches length of nail, that damaged the median nerve. There's a nerve. Again, in Greek, when they say hand, hand could either be a palm, or the hand can even be a wrist. So this is still a speculation about where Jesus was nailed in his palm or on the wrist. But medical history says that if he was nailed in the palm, the flesh could be ripped off and then he might fall flat. Probably he would have been nailed in the wrist, but the median nerve that goes through the entire body is the first damage that he went through when he was nailed. When he was nailed, it was 6 inches longer that he had to stretch his body on the cross, which means his joints could have been dislocated, his shoulders could have been dislocated on the cross. And this is called dorsal pedal artery. Dorsal pedal artery is a nerve that starts in the middle of the feet and that travels through the arteries of the leg and towards the spine as well. The weight of the body that pushed on, in fact, there was a belief that when Jesus was nailed, probably here a clutch was given so that he placed his leg for the weight to be taken. If it was not, when he was nailed on the cross, the entire weight of the body gets driven down to the leg. And the first damage when the nail was hit into the leg was this dorsal pedal artery, which is one of the most important nerve that starts from the leg. The nail would cause a severe nerve damage from the leg that goes through. So there are 2 damages that the history is talking about. One from the head to the toe and others from the toe to the head. And in that order, when Jesus was on the cross, if he'll have to speak, the air should pass through his vocal cords during his exhalation. Only then the diaphragm of the chest gets opened. Since he was nailed 6 inches stretched out and the dorsal artery is infected below, Gospels has recorded that there were 7 times Jesus still managed to speak from the cross. In fact, he was so kind enough to say, "Forgive them," which was the second last or the 6th word that he spoke. And the 7th was the last breath that he called out saying, "I'm giving up on the spirit." The soldiers pierced his side to assure that he was dead, but blood and water came out, referring to the water fluid surrounding the heart of the lungs. When this entire thing happened, like historically it says that the Crucifixion death can happen either between hours or it can last even couple of days. In this case, Jesus gave up his spirit earlier within hours. And because of all the pain, the lungs were formed with fluids. And that's the water that comes out when the soldier pierces on his right side of his chest. So, what are the last moments that Jesus went through with all that has been scientifically evolved? Could be partially true, could be partially wrong, could be just a hypothesis or a theory which is not proven. But what personally Jesus as an emotional person, in fact the shortest verse in the Bible says Jesus wept. Jesus was an emotional person. The first thing that he must have gone through was the hurt. But the question that I would want to ask each one of us, was Jesus hurt with the betrayal or did he feel accomplished? And what I'm driven to read the verse is from John 19:30. When Jesus had received the sour wine, he said, "It is finished." And he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. Finally, he felt only accomplished, but rather he did not feel hurt. Let me ask you a question. How many times in our life that we say we are hurt? We can't forget our hurt. We can't forget our past. How many times do we evolve within the past, calling ourselves saying that I'm hurt, I can't move on? If you're going to talk to a God who's just earless and speechless as a statue, he's not a God who's going to understand. But we are praying to a God who's not only would understand, but also has gone through the pain. If you're going to continue to talk about the pain that we are unforgiving, if you're going to continue to talk about the pain that we do not want to move on, it's like the packets that we store in our library that we want to take it out and use it, put it back, take it out and use it, take it and use it, put it back. Where is the hurt that Jesus went through? He was a man who was born to die, but why did he have to go through? Is the call of the word that he was born to die. If that was his hurt, how less is our hurt? How less is our hurt that we talk about it, we mull over it, and we kill our emotions to one other person. But if Jesus had to go through. And the second thing is the pain what Jesus went through. The question that I want to ask is, what extent of pain that Jesus was prepared for? And I love the verse from Isaiah. I don't love what he said, but how it's been described. Just as there were many who were appalled at him, his appearance was so disfigured beyond that of any human being, and his form marred beyond human likeness. Isaiah 52:14. There'll be a video that will be played at the end of this sermon, but while I was kind of trying to figure out a very close testimony on Jesus on the cross, apparently I landed with the testimony of the actor who acted in The Passion of Christ. I can't recall his name. His testimony says that Mel Gibson wanted to pass off this statement, the director of the movie, because he said, we will not be able to do a disfiguration of the image just to bring it into reality, to convince the crowd. Mel Gibson prayed over it saying that, God, I want to move away. I'll not be able to do justice to this statement because practically if I'll have to make my actor to look disfigured, which means I'll have to bring another person and make him stand. That's what this verse means. And the cross scene that was casted in the Passion of Christ, it took 5 weeks for that one scene to be executed. Why? It is difficult to replicate what the pain of Jesus went through. It is very difficult to apprehend what Jesus went through, even for a director like Mel Gibson, but still he kind of made justice to it. So this was the pain that he went through. Again, the same question. What is the pain that we are going through? Is it anywhere a fraction of what Jesus went through? If we could love the way Jesus would love, if we could love and be kind to our neighborhood, like the verse says, love thy neighbor, which is the greatest of command. If you could do all of that, why is that we can't apprehend the pain equivalent to what Jesus went through? It could be a physical pain, it could be emotional pain, it could be a trauma of the past, it could be fear of the future. But why is that we can't apprehend to the pain what Jesus went through? And the last T is the price. What price was he born to pay? The answer is very simple. Matthew 1:21. Jesus was born to die for his people. That was the price that he was casted. That was the price that he was brought in for. before I conclude, just two questions. Like I said, the cross, the story of the cross is not new to us. The story of the cross is heard through multiple different essence, multiple different situations and circumstances. But have we taken the pain of the middleman on the cross for granted? Have we taken it so light? Jesus died on the cross and then he rose up and then he lives a victorious life. There are a lot many times I've heard theologists talking about, why do you show the image of crucifixion? That's over. Show the image of resurrection. That's a new life. I completely agree to it. But how can we pass without knowing the details of what the crucifixion costed him or costed the life of mankind? If you have taken that for granted, we are at a serious danger place. Have we taken the story of the cross too light? It just happened 2000 years back. Now I am given salvation. Like Anna said, salvation is something that we'll have to keep purchasing it day in and day out. For once, if I'm going to take the salvation for granted, then tomorrow your salvation is lost. When I light the burner, very less that I cook, and all of you will agree to it. When I light the burner, I always kind of try keeping my hand close to fire. Fire does not slowly take its pace. It's like, okay, 5th second you can have so much, 7th second you can endure so much. Fire hits you right at that very second. It's the same thing with salvation. If you're going to give in salvation like a fire saying, I've got once, okay, I have it for 5 days or 7 days or 5 years or 7 years. No. Salvation can hit you every day, and every day we are in a position of losing a salvation if we have forgotten the story of the cross too light. If the answer is no, then know how to overcome your hurt. Then know to prepare to face your pain. Then believe that the price is already paid. Keeping that in mind, the answer to the original title is, how expensive is Jesus' death on the cross? And I'll request media team to play the video, please.
Clothes. Then they took long leather thongs with steel pellets or lead pellets on the end and beat him across the back until he could hardly stand up. Then they put a crown of thorns on his brow and his face was bleeding. And they laughed at him and they spit on him and they mocked him. And with one snap of his finger, 72,000 angels had already drawn their swords ready to come to his rescue and wipe this planet out of existence in the universe. And Jesus said, no, to this end was I born. He wasn't just another revolutionary. He wasn't just another hippie. He was not just another great man. He was God in the flesh. And oh, the ethics that he taught. Never a man spake like that man. When you get hit on one side, he says, turn the other cheek. He never said what to do after that. But he did say, forgive 70 times 7. Count that up. Jesus taught that we're to forgive. He taught a revolution in the way we're to live. He taught us that it wasn't just our outward actions that God judges, but it's the inward thoughts and intents. And he dragged and lifted and hauled that cross. He didn't squirm, he didn't yell, he didn't scream. He just took it and said, Lord, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. When he died on that cross, they nailed him, they put the nails in his hands. And you know what he said? Forgive them, they know not what they do. Forgive them. Could you forgive somebody that's putting nails in your hands and you know you didn't deserve it? Then look at the death he died. Did ever a man die like Jesus? The lightning flashed and the thunder roared and the earth began to shake. And even the soldiers confessed that this must be the Son of God. Anyone that can see Jesus on that cross and not be touched has a heart of stone. And then, on the cross, he said, "My God, why hast thou forsaken me?" And then he dropped his head and said, "It's finished." What did he mean? He meant your plan of salvation was finished. God can now forgive you of all your sins because Jesus had finished God's plan for your salvation. Because you see, God knows every one of you by name. He has the hairs of your head numbered.